I'm very honored to introduce Daniel Okrent to all of you. Daniel is an award-winning writer of multiple books, including Great Fortune, the epic of Rockefeller Center, which was a finalist for the 2004 Pulitzer Prize in history. He has worked for several places as an editor, most notably as the first public editor of the New York Times. This evening he's going to talk about his new book, The Guarded Gate. The book chronicles an anti-immigration campaign initiated during the late 1800s by Henry Cabot Lodge that lasted for decades. This campaign prevented the immigration of Jews and Eastern and Southern Europeans on the grounds that they were inferior and led to President Coolidge promoting eugenics as a national policy. Okrent's book chronicles this dark period of American history through intensive research and profiling of the key figures involved. Kirkus Reviews calls the book a relentlessly depressing, but revelatory and necessary historical account. Daniel will be in conversation with Strobe Talbott, a journalist, diplomat, and former president of Brookings. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming them to Politics and Prose.
Well, good evening to all of you. It's great that you would come in out of a glorious afternoon and evening. How's that? Like a rock star, right? Okay. It's terrific that you would come and have a conversation, and I hope as many as possible can get into the conversation this evening. We already know, of course, about this guy as a journalist. But that, there is a adage that a journalist writes the first draft of history. But this is a journalist who writes real history. I didn't ask Dan yet, but I'm going to ask him now. Was it Jack Kennedy who said, or at least made quite an open definition of America, and that is, America is a nation of immigrants?
It's been said by many, Kennedy among them, and I think would probably be said by many people in this room. Thank you all for coming. I promise not to be relentlessly depressing, only slightly depressing. It's been a cycle, Strobe. It's a sine wave that goes through American history. As early as 1753, I believe it was, Benjamin Franklin was writing about the Germans coming into Pennsylvania and destroying the culture that was being built and their language corrupting the English language. By the time we get to the Declaration and the early Republic, then immigration's a good thing. And then the Irish show up and it's a bad thing. And then it's a good thing because labor is so desperately needed during during the Civil War. But then there are all these Chinese who've built the railroads, so we have to keep them out. And this has been going on and off and on and off for the entire history of the country. We know where we are now, and it's not a very comfortable place.
And I think we would want to come to the present, but let's stay with the past for a moment. What in your passion for this subject really got you to for four years of your life?
Nearly 5. And it's staying with me because it's relentlessly depressing, I suppose. I probably shouldn't try to make jokes about it. The book began as a book about eugenics, and it came out of a conversation with a friend of ours who grew up in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, which was the center of eugenic research in America. And eugenics, wow, what an insane idea. And I began reading about it and its origins in the UK, and then it's coming across the Atlantic around 1900. And it was maybe, I don't know, a month or two into my reading, I encounter Henry Cabot Lodge. And of course, I knew Henry Cabot Lodge in history largely because of his successful opposition to the League of Nations. That's what he was famous for. But 25 years before that, he had begun this anti-immigrant campaign in 1895 when he introduced a bill into Congress in which he said very clearly, without mincing words at all, that we need to keep out these people from, and then he listed the countries of Eastern and Southern Europe. There was nothing in his view to be ashamed of. So that kind of caught my attention. It was pulling me away from eugenics until I find out later that the two come together, and I think that we'll get to that in a bit. But the primary engine, once I discovered that it was an immigration story, it wouldn't let me go. Not because of the current controversy. In fact, I think that I've never been so lucky to be a year and a half late on delivering a book. I seem to have stepped right into it. But that's the beginning.
Lodge is a big figure in this book, and he, of course, was a Boston Brahmin. To what degree was his desire to guard the gate? How much of it was economic, and how much of it was good old bigotry?
I think it was overwhelmingly the latter. There's a moment in his first efforts to stop immigration where Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the essence of the Boston Brahmin, the la-di-da boy from Nahant, he was called. There's a portrait in the National Portrait Gallery by John Singer Sargent that you must really go see. I have a piece that I wrote, an op-ed piece for the Post that they're posting tomorrow morning, that says that you feel like you are despoiling him by your very presence in front of this portrait. He was offended by the presence of these people who were different, who were other, whom he saw changing the nature of his city. He was different from many of the other early anti-immigration people in New England, where the movement really began, because he was not a progressive, whereas many of them were. It was to a large degree, a progressive era and progressive ideological movement for reasons that we'll get into soon. But Lodge introduces this bill. It passes both houses of Congress, and Grover Cleveland, on his last day in office, vetoes it. And then for the next 20 years, they continually bring it up in Congress. It passes Congress 3 more times, and 3 more times presidents veto it. They're not getting anywhere. And one of the things that is impeding them is that the immigrants who had been coming are now getting the vote, and the presidents are very careful about about how they perceive the new voters, and the anti-immigrationists have to come up with something else. If they're going to get this through, they need something else, and that's where eugenics comes into the story.
Tell our friends here a little bit about your own family. I assume you have in your family tree a lot of people who went through this gate, and maybe some that couldn't get through.
I think that's probably true of most of the people in the room, or at least certainly many people in the room. I say at the very first page of the book that I tell very briefly my family story, which my father's family, Jews, shtetl Jews from Poland, came in 1911 before there were any restriction laws. Then my grandfather, who was a physician, my maternal grandfather, came from Romania in 1922, right before the quotas go into place. And because he's here, he's able to bring my mother over 8 years later. Chain migration, you know the term. It's been around for a while. But I want to make clear here, as I try to do in the book, that I'm not saying that this story, my family's story, is worse than any other story. That certainly what the Chinese went through and all the other Asians, and of course what people of African origin went through, is far worse, far worse. This is just a story of bigotry and restriction. It just happens to be a story not only about me and many other people in this room, it's an untold story. It is largely untold, and that really was a motivation for me.
Tell the group about your publisher back then.
My book is published by Scribner, very famous name in American publishing. One of the great shocks that I found, and that was also shocking to some historians I know who've studied this a lot, is that the anti-immigration books, several of them, and especially, well, two key writers that we can talk about. Madison Grant, who wrote The Passing of the Great Race, which was published in 1916, which really first puts forward the idea of a racialized eugenics. And Lothrop Stoddard, who wrote a series of really hateful books, particularly attacking Asians. It was the white world supremacy was what he thought was endangered. The editor for all of these books was Maxwell Perkins. And every time I say it, people go, you know, that gasp. Am I projecting back there? Probably turned it off. Okay, thank you. The Perkins, who, of course, famously, the most famous editor in American publishing history, and the most respected one, who was the editor of Fitzgerald and Hemingway. And even in The Great Gatsby, there's a scene where one of these writers, Tom Buchanan, is speaking about him, and really Fitzgerald is having fun at his expense. But Perkins stayed with this program. Madison Grant, the instigator, as late as 1933, the Nazis had already come into power in Germany, and Scribner was still publishing again, Madison Grant. And there are some people who say, well, you know, publishers publish all sides of the coin, and I suppose they do. That doesn't mean they're endorsing their view, but there are two letters I quote in the book, one both from Perkins in 1933 to Grant. And one, he says, this particular book was not well received by critics. It was 1933, after all. And Perkins says to him, well, you know, there are certain races who control reviewing in America. That's why it didn't do so well. And don't worry, said the second letter, it'll do much better in England where the Jews aren't as powerful. That's not passive acceptance of what somebody else is doing. So Scribner had published my last book, which was a history of Prohibition. And I want to do this book, and I say, you know, I'd like to write a book about, and well, you know, Maxwell Perkins, they had no idea. And at first there was some resistance. Do we really want to do this? And then to their credit, I think they realized better they should publish it than have somebody else publish it. And they've been nothing but supportive.
I think we ought to stay for just a minute, maybe a couple, on anti-Semitism. To what degree was the Holocaust a push for Americans to say and to understand and to open the gate? And to what degree were Americans letting those unfortunate people stay in Europe?
Well, it's beyond my period, and there are people who have written much more authoritatively about the Holocaust and the post-Holocaust period and the Roosevelt administration's involvement in the rather passive involvement, or the New York Times' passive coverage of it. If I may, going back to, this is a question that came up very early on. It seemed to me from my research that anti-Semitism among the upper classes of the Northeast was normative in the late 19th and early 20th century. In fact, it was much more common, if not as virulent, as anti-Italian feeling, because there were actually Jews that these people were encountering, whereas the Italians they encountered they dismissed them as really not, almost not being human. They were shoeshine men and fruit sellers. But among the upper classes, it would have been surprising to find somebody who wasn't. And the best, well, there are two illustrations. One is a man named Joseph Lee, who's a very important character in the book. He was the first citizen of Boston, a great progressive, a very wealthy man whose life was nothing but philanthropy, who supported every possible cause that all right-thinking people, like I'm sure all of us in this room would support. Voting rights for blacks. He kept, as chairman of the Boston School Committee, he kept the schools open at night so the immigrants could learn English. He brought doctors and dentists into the school system. He supported the Cowaliga Training School for black students in Alabama, and any number of other things. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom he supported. He also single-handedly financed the anti-immigration movement, and in one letter to a friend that I found in his files, He said, soon Europe will be drained of all of its Jews, perhaps to its benefit, but not to ours. He was having lunch with Louis Brandeis less than a month after that. He also said there was another letter of his in which he was asked by a friend, why are you putting so much effort into this? And he said, because if we don't, America is going to become a Dago nation. This was as cultivated a human being as one could find, and as liberal-minded as one could find. The other example is a 33-year-old woman of very fine parentage, upbringing, private education at home, but very fine education. 2 letters written when she's 32, 33 years old. One, she has met Felix Frankfurter at a party in Cambridge when Frankfurter is teaching at the law school at Harvard, and writes to her mother-in-law. He was a very interesting man, but very Jew. End of sentence. And then the other letter is, I would rather be hanged than go to another Jew party where all they talk about is money, jewels, and sables. That was Eleanor Roosevelt. That's another one that always gasps. She saw the light. She obviously changed her mind, as many of these people did. She learned as she got into a wider world. But if even Eleanor Roosevelt, the absolute paragon of tolerance, felt that way, I think you get a sense of how widespread this was.
Is there anybody else who would like to get into the conversation? I've got a few thoughts of my own. Okay. The question was who was against it? I mean, against the anti-immigration. Yeah. Well, just if I may, backing up a minute, this all leads to a law that passes in 1924 and that is in place for 41 years that effectively keeps all of these people who are crammed between the Mediterranean and the Baltic out of the country. The author of the law, Albert Johnson, congressman from Washington State, he determined late in life that 18 million people would have come to the U.S., but his law, he was proud to say, kept them out. So who was against it? Well, the last veto of a much milder law was overridden by Congress because the sentiment was so much in favor of it. And by 1924, when the law is finally passed, it is overwhelmingly, it's not even close. There's not even a thought that it can be stopped. Now, were there people who were active in trying to oppose it along the way? Yes, and they were dismissed because they were from the ethnic groups that were being kept out. There were some very clear exceptions to that. One of the ethnic groups that was not being kept out were the Irish. The Irish had been here long enough and had so many votes that even Henry Cabot Lodge in Massachusetts had to pay attention to acknowledge, as he fundamentally did, that they're white, and that was a distinction that he was making. But James Michael Curley was a great leader of the pro-immigration cause, and many other congressmen with Irish last names from the big cities that may have had to do with the nature of the democratic political machines of the time. In the science community, the primary voice was the great anthropologist Franz Boas, who boldly start from the very beginning, and he's the father of American anthropology. And of course, Madison Grant dismisses him on the grounds, well, he's Jewish, no wonder. And it's a complicated story why he gets kicked off a national anthropological panel around that same time, accused of being pro-German during the war. So the ability to tar anyone who was against it, the weapons were near to hand. Well, the first one was Grover Cleveland, who said in his veto message in 1897, he said it was just a pretext for exclusion, which is exactly what it was. And all of the, this idea of Henry Cabot Lodge, friend of labor, it didn't really wash. Then the next one was vetoed by William Howard Taft in his last month in office. And then Woodrow Wilson, not exactly known as a paragon of tolerance, he in 1915, Alan, is it? 1950. This man knows much more about this than I do, but it's not his night. So, Alan Kraut, very distinguished historian of immigration, and then Wilson vetoes it again in 1970, and that's when it's overridden. Margaret Sanger.
always comes up. Margaret Sanger is an extremely controversial figure, not just in her well-known career as she coined the term birth control, but in eugenics. And there are some charges thrown at Sanger that are scurrilous about particularly a letter that she ostensibly wrote saying that we want to keep it secret from the blacks in the South that we want to eliminate their race. There were two key sentences left out of that letter that totally make it was the opposite of that. But Sanger, as late as her autobiography in 1938, is endorsing eugenics. She invited Madison Grant to come and speak at eugenics congresses. She thought she had a very close relation at birth control congresses. She had a very close relationship with Lothrop Stoddard. And I believe that two things. One, Sanger would make an alliance with anybody who supported her cause. And it didn't matter what you thought about other things. She was so single-minded on providing access to birth control for American women that she took on some colleagues that perhaps we wouldn't like her to have taken on. But the other thing, if you stop and think about it, and this is a difficult thing to conjure, is that eugenics and birth control, there's a relation. It's planned breeding. Eugenics says let's only have the good breed with the good, and we'll have better people. Let's not let the bad breed. Birth control is obviously different, but it is also planned. It's the intrusion of an idea or of the state or of religion into what should be the privacy between a man and a woman. And she didn't run away from it sufficiently. I think it's fair to say that she was a eugenist, supported the eugenic doctrine, and in terms of immigration, at one point, she's saying, look at the slums. Look at the Italians in the slums and how fast they're reproducing. We have to stop that reproduction. Not a very good way of putting it. So.
Staying with eugenics, two questions. One, how was it possible in a relatively enlightened century for this totally screwed up fake science, and it wasn't just people like reading books about it, but real scientists were doing it. And what killed it at the end?
Let me, if I may, give a little bit of a history. Eugenics really comes out of the Darwinian Revolution and the great tumult and turmoil when the scientific world finally comes to the conclusion that we don't all come from Adam and Eve. There was something else that brought about the species. Well, first, once you determine that we are not all derived from Adam and Eve, therefore we are not all brothers and sisters, then we're different from one another, and that invites racial distinction and racial hatred and the whole idea of one group's superiority over another. A first cousin of Darwin's, named Francis Galton, in 1869, publishes a book in which he puts forward the theory that he later names eugenics, that if we breed the best to the best, we'll have a better country. And at one point, he even suggests that the best way to improve Britain is to find I don't remember, it was 2,500 men and 2,500 women, or 5,000 of each, who are the very best among our young people, and arrange marriages for them, have them all married as a group in a ceremony in Westminster Abbey presided over by Queen Victoria. And then after that, they then leave and get an annual stipend for their reproductive lives, so that instead of going out and working in the workplace, they can work at the real job of making better Britons. This idea stumbles across the Atlantic around the same time that Gregor Mendel's famous paper about pea plants is discovered. And in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, the key figure in advancing eugenic science in America, a really interesting man and a very important and genuine scientist, animal geneticist named Charles Davenport, he mashes these two ideas together. And soon, Galton's idea, which came to be known as positive eugenics, let's breed the best to the best, there's a corollary, negative eugenics. Let's keep those who are deficient from breeding. And that led to the sterilization movement, which I'm sure most people in the room know about. and also expanded this notion of stopping people from coming into the country because they were going to corrupt the American bloodstream. Now, at first, Davenport's idea, it was directed at individuals. If, as they come in, we stop those who are epileptic, blind, deaf, alcoholic, feeble-minded, to use the phrase of the day, let's just stop them from coming in. But Madison Grant, 1916, he applies it to national groups. He's the one who takes eugenics, negative eugenics, and turns it into racialized eugenics. Grant was the founder of the Bronx Zoo. He's the man who saved the redwoods of Northern California, universally acknowledges that as that. He was the leading conservationist, environmentalist of his age in the country. And he saw there was a continuity between those. He wanted to preserve the American landscape, and he wanted to preserve what he deemed to be the American bloodstream. And he published this book with the help of Maxwell Perkins in 1916. And the key paragraph that kind of reflects the thinking in it. Now that we know that science has proven, and he cites a few of these scientists who had already begun to move into this area, that any mating between two national groups, the offspring of that mating will revert to the lesser group. We know this. And he's using, his thought behind that is Mendel's pea plants, because, over time, those pink plants and white plants are neither pink nor white. They get kind of muddy because of the bad bloodstream. I mean, he had no idea what he was talking about, but he was very articulate and he was very well connected. And the key paragraph, there had been identified, and he picked this up and ran with it, what he saw as the three European national groups. There were the Nordics, who were tall, blonde, brave, generous, terrific in every way. There were the Alpines, not bad, not so great. And then there were the lowly, really lowly Mediterraneans. Yes, they were good at art, but other than that, he was really writing these things, not quite that language. But he then writes a paragraph. We know that because the racial group will revert to the lesser of the two groups. We know that the mating between a Nordic and an Alpine will yield an Alpine. And the mating between an Alpine and a Mediterranean will yield a Mediterranean. And the mating between any of the three European races and a Jew will yield a Jew. And this sort of really put it in a nutshell. And it became, the ideas that he was putting forward became so widely picked up by people who had credentials and who also wanted to keep immigrants out of the country, that it became kind of common knowledge. In 1921, an article appears in Good Housekeeping magazine that says that now that biological laws, those are the words, biological laws have proven that these Eastern and Southern Europeans are inferior, they must be kept out of the country by legislation. The author of that article was Calvin Coolidge, 2 months before he was sworn in as vice president. It was ubiquitous. It was accepted. Every university in the country was teaching eugenics. Those who were arguing against it at certain places, they were muffled out. In the popular press, there were contests for picking the best eugenic babies. There were films of, the early, it's not really Hollywood. There's a famous film called The Black Stork, that is about a corrupted baby because of bad genes. There was a brief period when somebody could get certified by the federal government as being eugenically valuable. The governor of Connecticut wanted all marriages to be certified in advance to make certain that we weren't letting bad blood into the bloodstream. It beggars belief, which is a phrase I use all the time. But it was not just the law of the land, it was the feeling of the land. And even there are examples of Jews saying, well, of course, we're okay, but those Eastern European Jews, not so okay. Or we're okay, but not the Poles, not the Romanians. Everybody needs somebody else to look down on.
Excuse me.
No, I just want to comment. Yeah, my high school biology teacher in the late 1960s very memorably said to us, can you believe that they're allowing mentally ill people to reproduce? I'll never forget that. 1968. High school biology teacher.
40 years before that was the famous Buck v. Bell Supreme Court decision.
Now let me just add one thing though. 3 words: dirty Arab terrorists. Okay. And I want to take this argument that you're making in your research a little bit into the present day and just point out that the intellectual, before we congratulate ourselves here for being so liberal and wonderful, politics and prose, and so tolerant and progressive, that this city has produced a form of racism and discrimination against Arab Americans, against Arabs for being congenitally violent, dirty, threatening. And it continues today. But this is long before Trump. You know, this has been going on for 20, 30 years. Martin Peretz at the New Republic, you name it. It's very sad. I mean, it's more depressing grist for your mill.
No, well, really relent. You've said nothing for me to disagree with except insulting everybody at politics. No, I'm kidding. About no. It is absolutely, and in fact, I've got a op-ed piece that I've written for the Post. It makes a direct comparison between the plan that Jared Kushner announced and the president elaborated on. It's the same thing all over again. Let in the people with high education. Where do people with high education come from? Highly educated countries. They don't come from Yemen. They don't come from Honduras. Let's stop chain migration. Well, where are the people in chain migration coming from? They're coming from the countries that have been coming into the people have been coming to the country from Mexico, from Central America. No, it never goes away. Never goes away.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. I find in listening to you that you're putting a heavy emphasis on elites and science, or the misuse of science. And that's all fine and good, and I have no quarrel with it. It seems to me, though, that looking at this period, and I know a little bit about it, there were other social, economic, political factors that, the non-elites felt very strongly. An example, let's look at the Italians. The Italians were associated with anarchism, terror, violence, Sacco Vanzetti at this very time. They were associated with organized crime. They were undermining abolition. One could go on and on. In other words, in addition to the Eugenics and the Henry Cabot Lodges, who were making speeches and writing books and articles, it seems to me that there was popular resentment and bigotry aimed at Jews and Italians and the rest, and that it reflected social, economic, moral factors and had relatively little to do with eugenics. What's your response to that?
You're absolutely right. Movements need leadership. Movements need intellectual or ideological justification. They need political elites, finally, to do something. The other group that was most against immigration was organized labor. Because, of course, it brought down wages. And the founding head of the AFL, Samuel Gompers, himself a Jewish immigrant in his case, from England, he said, there's only one thing in my life I've ever agreed with Henry Cabot Lodge about, is keeping immigrants out. There are all those things you say are correct. What I'm trying to do in this book is explain the larger framework, the ideological and political framework that enabled that to flower.
Thanks again for being here and for writing the book. In it, you mention a little bit about this, like that immigrants are coming into, say Henry Cabot Lodge's hometown of Boston and changing it. And during that time period, a huge wave of Italian immigrants came there to basically transform the North End and in lots of other places as well. You said also that these people were slowly getting the vote. Why didn't they organize to try and stop it, the 1924 Act? Are there just not enough of them? Are they not well organized or involved in the political process?
There weren't enough of them, or and this is a very familiar story, they were concentrated. They were concentrated in certain cities, and thus their political power was not as great as it been had they been spread out more widely. There was opposition; it just could never. Even the opposition. I said before that there were Jews who would make the case about other Jews being not as good. Fiorello LaGuardia, in 1924, half Jewish, half Italian, he says, "Well, you have to let us in, but we should keep out the Asians." A lot of the people involved, the politicians who were leading the anti-immigration movement, they were temporizing. They were finding a way. Well, we're with you. We understand you, but just don't let it touch us.
And can I just follow up really quick on one thing? Following up on that, there are some immigrants from not just like Eastern and Southern Europe, but from other places, I think Syria and Armenia, that come in. Not many of them, but Henry Cabot Lodge makes one thing where he says, and these people, the Syrians and Armenians, the Asiatics coming in, are the worst of all. I was wondering if you knew.
Well, I don't know that phrase, but he did single out. Syrians was a kind of an all-purpose term for Arabs. I don't know why it was Syrians and not something else, but yes, he was clear about that. But their numbers didn't approach the numbers, particularly of the Italians. The Italians were the largest group coming in, and by way of illustration of how the 1924 law worked, in a year not long before that, 222,000 Italians came into the country under open immigration, and under the quota put in place in 1924, it was reduced to fewer than 6,000. And that stayed in place for 41 years. And the similar numbers applied to all these other groups. The really one kind of astonishing one, these numbers were based on the percentage of people from each of those countries that were already in the U.S. and their descendants. So if 10% of the Americans came from country A, then 10% of the immigrants would be allowed to come from country A. Now, how do they determine what the makeup of the population was? Well, they didn't use the 1920 census, which was at that point 4 years old. They didn't use the 1910 census, the 1900. They went back to the 1890 census before the big immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe picked up. It was so brazen. It was astonishing that they could get away with such a thing. The consequence was that for groups that didn't come until after 1890, like the Greeks, who really don't begin to come in large numbers until the first decade of the century for a variety of reasons, both economic and having to do with the wars with Turkey, Turkish oppression. There were so few in 1890 that their quota in 1924 was 100. 100 a year. That was the minimum for any European country, and that stayed in place. So I don't know whether there are people of Greek parentage here, but if you are, I have a feeling your parents got here before 1924.
I just want you to know that Danny was that smart in high school. We went to high school together, and even more so in college. So, being an immigrant myself, and Danny a child one, I just finished a film on Moberg, which parenthetically
this is the filmmaker of Viva Kempner.
That's opening up the street on Friday. And what occurs to me, because he was in the OSS, how short-sighted these restrictions were. Because, in fact, the best OSS agents during World War II was the Italian whose father had come from Sicily, who knew the typology, the language, and ran OSS in Italy, and Moberg, who knew like 10 languages and had that growing up. And, of course, the Japanese would have been if they hadn't been so restricted. So what I'm curious is, didn't they see that the war was I guess part of the point of the OSS was we were so bad in intelligence, and partly was that we didn't even look to our own immigrants, or that we hadn't had enough of them coming in to know about what was happening.
Thank you. I think that this is a little bit out of my territory, but one can go into the history of the U.S. State Department and of the OSS and who was running it and what kind of people were working there.
No, but they allowed those people in. It was just that. Yeah.
No, what I'm suggesting is prejudice is blind. Prejudice doesn't see individuals. It sees groups and assigns to them specific qualities that may have nothing to do with the group. So it's not just a matter of, and I don't mean to diminish the importance of what it would have been like to have better OSS agents during World War II, but in every field of endeavor, who built this country? How was it built?
Immigrants.
It was built by new blood coming in. And here, blood from, already Asian blood had been kept out. The Chinese had been kept out since 1882. The Japanese, through some, almost really through negotiation that wasn't even public, starting in 1907, kept out. In 1922, there's a Supreme Court case in which an Indian, a man of Asian Indian heritage, who had come to the U.S. in 1912, became a citizen, enlisted in the Army during World War I, got an honorable discharge, and then had his citizenship taken away from him because he was neither white nor black, which were the two racial qualifications for citizenship under the 1870 Nationality Act. This went to the Supreme Court, where there was a 9-0 unanimous decision that this was a correct decision to take away his citizenship. Among the signers of that decision were Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis D. Brandeis. It was a crazy, crazy world. Crazy world.
Tell the group what happened to the guy.
Oh, well, there's another man in a similar case in San Francisco, whose last name was Singh. He had been running a grocery store in San Francisco since 1915. He had his citizenship taken away from him, and he wrote a letter to the San Francisco, I believe it was the Chronicle, telling his story, and that letter was his suicide note.
Yeah, and then, of course, when it came to the Holocaust or saving Jews, pre-38 or as that was going, these still restrictive laws prevented. The State Department really showed its anti-Semitism.
The restrictive laws stayed in place for 41 years. But another thing that is going on in the 30s that we have to pay attention to, with the rise of the Nazis. Hitler read Madison Grant. He quoted him in speeches. In 1924, in Mein Kampf, he writes about how we have to look to our American friends because they understand what's wrong with open immigration. They're trying to keep their country pure. But also, the men, and they were all men, who became the leading German race scientists under the Hitler regime, they had been in regular contact at conferences, meetings, coming across the ocean with the American eugenicists. And in the Nuremberg trials, at the doctor's trial, one of the defenses was, wait, you can't say that this is a crime. We were doing what your people were doing. And as I say in the book, the conventional line is, we were following orders. No, they were following Americans. And it was very present. And one of the leading eugenicists actually gets an honorary degree from Heidelberg, University of Heidelberg in 1936, for being the far-sighted leader in racial politics and racial policy in the U.S. It went directly into Nazism. This also led to the end of, this is back to where we began. Where did eugenics go? Well, one day, all the institutions, most of them that had been supporting eugenic research, they woke up and said, oh my God, look what's happening in Germany. So the Carnegie Institution of Washington, which was the primary funder of eugenic research going back to 1904, they stopped. The Rockefeller Foundation, they stopped. The Harriman family, which had really funded almost all of Charles Davenport's work, they stopped. They're all pulling back. The American Museum of Natural History, which I think is the #1 institutional supporter of and certifier of eugenics research, even they pulled back and have been embarrassed about it ever since. So the only remaining open support for eugenics by 1936, 1937, 1938 are American Nazis, or Americans who are sympathetic to the Nazis. And then it whittles away.
I may make some mistakes in speaking because I had 3 strokes, but I woke up, unable to speak, but that's okay. I wrote a letter to the Times when you could write a letter to the Times with another person, and the person was Norm Hill. I don't know if you know the name, but he was the descendant of A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, and he came in charge of the name Norm Hill. And he and I wrote a letter to the Times pointing out that DNA had proven, and they had printed that, proven that we all came out of Africa.
Yeah, the tree where man was born. That's
Yes, and that they should no longer use the term black race, because that was mistaken to make the term black race. And just to say there's a difference between ethics, or a congressman, whatever you say, could point out who the kind of group of differences were, but that would be okay, but not to call about it's a race.
Yeah, the concept of race, was that something that was very fluid in the 19th century and into the 20th and 21st. And I think that if there's any key discovery of the analysis of DNA or the human genome, was we realized that everybody in the room, probably 98% of us, have the same genes. And there's really no meaningful distinction. Thank you.
And the Times didn't print it.
Oh. Somehow I knew that was the case. My apologies.
Just going to interrupt briefly. We do have time for one or two more questions, if anybody else is interested.
Maybe I could just go in.
Please.
What was the role of what was the role of religion? Or I should probably say, what were the multiple roles of religion in this whole controversy and debate?
Interestingly, the free thinkers, like Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was the head of the American Museum of Natural History for 25 years, Madison Grant's best friend, and the leading visible scientific figure, a really important figure. I mean, imagine the scientist who's on television today, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Imagine if somebody of that visibility was really leading the argument for eugenics. He was an atheist. Grant was an atheist. They believed in science. They didn't follow religion. That was mumbo jumbo to them. And in fact, Osborn, in 1925, when John Scopes gets in trouble in Dayton, Tennessee for teaching evolution, he's teaching from a book called A Civic Biology that has a chapter on eugenics in it. And Osborn he says, Scopes is my intellectual grandson. He is carrying this modern idea of science forward. And there are very few instances that I'm aware of religious leaders invoking this language. The Catholic Church was wildly against eugenics for many, many reasons. It's for those of us who like to think of ourselves as free thinkers, it's really kind of scary to find this very direct connection.
Picking up from this lady's, you should make sure that letter somehow gets read. The foundational document of the United States was written by a free thinker. And of course, the phrase is all humans are. Oh man, gotta face the facts. Well, actually, I think it was supposed to be gender neutral and colorblind. But in any event, the most important document of our own, the United States, is the phrase that came from the Enlightenment. And did that come into the debate at all during the time when this nonsense was going on?
Not to a large degree, and I'm so glad to see Alan shaking his head in agreement with me on this one. Yes, there are times when it's evoked. For instance, in Cleveland's veto, where he says a pretext for exclusion, that is preceded by a fairly lengthy statement about how we're a nation of immigrants, and it is foundational that we accept people from all over the world and have made America what it is. But that's I don't want to dismiss it and say that it was sloganeering, but it was just not in the forefront of the debate. There was something very practical in the forefront of the debate, and those were those boats at Ellis Island disgorging these people onto these uncorruptible shores. With that...
A fascinating conversation. How about one more round of applause for Daniel Okrent and Strobe Talbott?